the flyers.
Yeah, that's
Great to have you all here, students and faculty. Today, I feel very honored to introduce Dr. Fabiola Lopez Duran and welcome her to our FIU community. Fabiola, or Dr. Lopez Duran, is an associate professor of art and architectural history at Rice University in Houston, Texas. She earned her PhD in the history, theory, and criticism of architecture from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT. Adopting a transnational and interdisciplinary perspective, Lopez Duran's research and teaching focuses on the complicities between capitalism, racism, and the construction of the built environment. She is the author of the award-winning book, Eugenics in the Garden, Transatlantic Architecture and the Crafting of Modernity, and co-editor of the Aggregate Architectural History Collaborative's new book that is called Architecture in Development, Systems and the Emergence of the Global South. Anecdotally, I'm just going to share something. I met, somehow, because we never saw each other, but I met Fabiola in 1994. At the time, she curated and organized an exhibition in Caracas that was called Un Lugar para Arquitectos. And it was a beautiful show with also a symposium with 4 architects from Switzerland, from a specific region. And one of the big names was Mario Botta, that some of you might know. And we all knew he was the star architect of the times. But together with Mario Botta, she brought Aurelio Garfetti, Luigi Snozzi, and Livio Bacchini, that were masters of modern architecture that we didn't know as students. Obviously, in an auditorium it's the same as you are sitting today. And I was fascinated with those architects and the architecture that they were showing. And this is before internet or any of the resources that we have
Amazing how
today.
old
so
we are.
People went to Caracas and showed the projects with slides, with the slide project, and talk about the practices they have. And it was just fascinating. And that was a collaboration between the Museum of Fine Arts in Caracas and the Swiss Embassy. And it was a major enterprise that today, when I look back, I think all the effort to get those 4 architects in a place like Caracas to talk about architecture, and how grateful and lucky we were to have someone behind that project like Fabiola. Later, in 2002, I was teaching at a university, and a group of my students from Universidad Simón Bolívar told me that they couldn't assist to something because they were volunteering on a secret project with Prophet Fabiola. And it was an installation of a public art by an amazing artist, Felice Badini, in the city of Caracas. And they were secretive about it, and they were working during the nights and the weekends. And it was another sort of amazing project designed and procured by Fabiola at that time. So, as chair of the Department of Architecture at FIU, I am very proud to welcome a very special guest, an esteemed colleague who, through continuous, rigorous, and formal education, had built a very strong voice in the international forum, and today is here in FIU with us. I look forward to more dialogues and discussions on the Global South, present challenges with you, our students, and my colleagues and faculty, with total confidence that FIU is a welcoming space for these conversations. Please join me and welcome Dr. Fabiola Lopez Duran.
This one is on. Okay. Thank you. That's so sweet. Good afternoon. Thank you so much, Henry, for such a lovely introduction. You made me feel very old. I cannot believe that I was doing something that big when I was such a young architect in 1994. And thank you, Elisa and Henry, both of you, for this invitation. I'm really happy to be here. And what I'm going to share today with you is a sort of synthesis that goes back and forth between chapter 2 and chapter 4 of my book, Eugenics in the Garden. And this is a work that goes back and forth between France and Brazil. And I'm going just to tell you a story that has to do with this. Well, Elisa is showing me the book here. That has to do with this very particular complicity between medicine and architecture that in the process of implementing eugenics in Latin America, use architecture as a technology of this utopian project. So let me start here. Okay. Let me start with something that happened in the very first Brazilian Congress of Eugenics in July of 1929. So at the first Brazilian Congress of Eugenics in July of 1929, the physician and anthropologist Edgar Roquetti Pinto addressed an audience preoccupied with the question of how a country as vast as Brazil could best increase and improve its population. To accomplish this, Roquetti Pinto proposed a new science, or pseudoscience, called eugenia, eugenics, that together with medicine and hygiene will guarantee the efficiency and perfection of the race. According to him, eugenics, the social and biological movement that strove for nothing less than the improvement of the human race, named not only heredity, but also the environment as its primary tools. With the following words, the Brazilian scientists underscore a positivist agenda that brought architecture to the very core of the eugenics movement in Latin America. Quote, "It is critical to emphasize that the influence on our race does not stem from the natural environment, but rather from the artificial environment created by man." End quote. In his opening remarks to Congress, Roquetti Pinto was calling attention to the crucial role that the man-made environment plays in the amelioration, in the improvement of what he called the biological patrimony of Brazil's diverse population. Roquetti Pinto, in his invitation to social engineering, was pointing to the environmental genetic interaction that they hope will bring with it the very possibility of progress. So my story begins in Rio de Janeiro, at a critical global moment in which scientific discourses articulated in France crossed the ocean and then became intertwined with discourses of architecture, aesthetics, landscape, and urban planning in early 20th century Brazil. At the epicenter of this ideological encounter was the utopian project of eugenics, but a very particular form of eugenics, which based on Jean-Baptiste Lamarck's theory of the inheritance of acquired characteristics, conceptualized evolution as driven by adaptation to environmental changes, in contrast to Mendelian eugenics, which view evolution as impervious to the environment and driven solely by genetics. Probably you know Lamarck became very famous for this theory that the giraffe this animal has a very long neck because it was a sort of deformation of its body by trying to reach the food, right? And this transformation or a modification in its body was able to be transmitted, genetically speaking, through different generations, but by the influence of the environment. So he had this very particular theory that of the inheritance of acquired characteristics that was basically contradicting Mendelian theories that it was impermeable to the environment. So the plot of this story is driven by Brazil's conviction that eugenics was its critical instrument in the crafting of a modern nation. So in 1920s and 1940s, this belief brought together a diverse cast of characters, politicians, technocrats, scientists, architects, and intellectuals alike, from the physicians and architects of the Parisian Musée Social, which was a very early think tank, French think tank, that sought to undertake France's pressing social question, to the physicians and architects in Rio de Janeiro who formulated the theories, practices, and ethos of Brazil's social modernity, to Le Corbusier, who began formulating a eugenicist ideology during those months he spent in Brazil in the 1930s. So my story's narrative revolves around these individuals, all converging in a particular territory at the center of Rio de Janeiro, essentially a eugenics laboratory. So my talk is going to be divided in two sessions. So the first one that I titled Practicing Utopia starts in that very particular area. So in the early 1920s, a highly dramatic event occurred in this very territory. The battle against bubonic plague, yellow fever, and other tropical diseases had led to radical sanitary and urban reform that reached its climax with the spectacular demolition of an entire populated mountain located at the center of the Brazilian capital. It's this mountain that you see here. The idea of eliminating the mountain was not new. As far as back as 1798, a medical report had argued for the mountain's demolition, since according to the author, it acted as an enormous barrier that blocked the circulation of air from the sea and consequently facilitated the proliferation of diseases. But it was not until the 1920s when the aesthetic and moral reasons were added to sanitary ones that the mountain became the very negation of modernity itself, a reservoir of vice and diseases, a place of a marginal population, mostly poor blacks, poor Europeans, and Middle Eastern immigrants, disregarded as blacks or socially constructed as blacks, who according to the elites invaded the center of the city, quote, with their embarrassing practices of superstition and misery, end quote. So magazines and newspapers at the time referred to the mountains in medical terms as a tumor in the center of the city that the modernization of the city would remove, extirpar, for the beauty of Rio. At that time, medicine became the principal tool used by the elites to study and then reconfigure their national population. It was only at this point when hygiene, that until then was understood as personal or environmental, became social hygiene, an economic science concerned with the outputs of human capital. And here I'm talking about production, but also reproduction. So it was only in that moment that the demolition of the Morro do Castelo was possible. So this dramatic demolition, which generated an extensive territory immediately occupied by the 1922 International Exhibition commemorating the centennial of Brazil's independence, represented the first and most radical action in the construction of a new national image, free of backward associations and racial exoticism. In other words, the exhibition was conceived as a self-portrait of a modern nation, a nation that undertook a self-remaking process not only of its milieu, but of its population. Promoting itself as a tabula rasa, the exhibition represented a literal triumph over the territory, a territory now cleansed of its colonial history and unwanted inhabitants. I have to tell you that that mountain that was inhabited was actually the foundation of the city. So the first church, the first convent, the first governmental palaces were all there. But at some point, the elite left the mountain and started moving towards the south neighborhoods of Rio, and the mountain became, for them, what they call a reservoir of vice and diseases. So for this exhibition, they published a more than 500-page catalog, which is striking in its complete elimination of all traces of the African and indigenous component of the Brazilian culture, as well as the country's prehispanic past and its legacy of slavery. With the exception of one single article briefly mentioning the abolition of slavery, the catalog presents Brazil as a white country. An examination of its images provides an excellent demonstration of a new alliance between beauty, health, tropicality, and modernization that the Brazilian elites adopted to represent themselves and their nation. As you can see in most publicity materials, white men, women, and children of classic Greco-Roman appearance, wearing red or white robes and crowns, were arranged against a transplanted European-looking hill and gardens to frame the architecture and machinery of modern factories. And just as human beings were portrayed as icons of the ideal, so too were natural monuments, released from their tropical fatality, politicized as new icons of collective identity, and moralized as elements of transformation directly linked to the reimagining of the body. So in several advertisements, the catalog exalted the natural monuments of Rio de Janeiro, particularly those human-made or human-dominated. In fact, an advertisement that you see here for a medication portrays the Pão de Açúcar as one of the 7 wonders of the world. It also celebrates the Corcovado, the extraordinary mountain at the center of the Tijuca forest, the world's largest human-made urban rainforest, which will be crowned a few years later with a monumental 40-meter-tall statue of Christ the Redeemer. It was in 1922, during this exhibition celebrating the centennial anniversary of Brazil, that the foundation stone of the monumental sculpture was ceremoniously laid at the top of the mountain. So, not yet. So, raising the Morro do Castelo, while transforming 2 other mountains within the city into a space of pure aesthetic pleasure, tropical nature, now monumentalized, is portrayed precisely as a site of the interplay between the body, labor, and technology. But the 1922 exhibition not only represented a triumph over nature, but a triumph over degeneration. In fact, the Brazilian Congress for the Protection of Infants, and essentially part of the exhibition, was at the core of Brazil's transformation of puericulture, which was a sort of French-based faith-based science, how can I say? Something that was between science and faith, into a neo-Lamarckian form of eugenics. So if any of you grew up, well, no, you are too young, but somebody like me who grew up in Venezuela, girls in Venezuela has to take a class that was called puericulture, which was based on this clear idea that the world was heterosexual, racist, and machista, and it was all about women learning how to have a good marriage in order to improve the race and how to take care of the kids. So, revealing the influence of French medicine on Brazilian medical circles, the debates in Congress focus on the importance of puericulture, the term that Adolphe Pinard, the French physician and member of the Musée Social in Paris, revitalized as a human analog of agriculture, but for the scientific cultivation of the modern child unit. So they were really thinking about agriculture for human beings, and for that unit, the modern child unit. So echoing Pinard, Brazilian physicians were convinced that puericulture, that a child was the result of two forces in equilibrium, heredity and milieu, and that consequently puericulture was one of the most accessible ways of conserving and perfecting the human species, while, of course, whitening the population. But the Congress was not the only event promoting puericulture at the exhibition. Inspired by the Children's Museum of the World Fair in Paris in 1900, an exhibition was installed at the Palacio das Férias to present an encyclopedic panorama of Brazil's childhood. It portrays Brazil in its relentless march towards progress and puericulture as a system of state control over children's bodies to improve the biological capital of the nation. So children were no longer seen as the offsprings of individual families, but as the nation's future, as such as the nation's children. So the exhibition showcases a series of state modern programs and policies that demonstrate the elite's welfare ideology and its mission to preserve structures of power based on race and class. So among these programs and policies were los patronatos agrícolas, the patronatos agrícolas that hosted poor delinquent minors to secure a labor force, child welfare legislation to implement a system of medical inspections and new code to police children's activities and regulate their labor, and also healthy baby context, promoting the wide racial ideal. So multiple photojournalist montages were published in mass media during 1922, revealing the racist nature of this context. This one, showing 5 white children winner, was even titled Una raza que se afirma, a race that affirms itself, as you can see it on the top. So just as the exhibition promoted white supremacy and its catalog was overrun by Hellenic-looking people, the demolished mountain's footprint was suddenly overrun by neocolonial pavilions and even by a splendid hydroplane port built to provide a glorious entrance to the capital city. So let's pay attention to why the neocolonial as a style that ended representing Brazil for many years. So the adoption of neocolonial architecture was followed a few years later by an invitation to French Beaux-Arts architect, a member of the Musée Social, Donald Alfred Agache, to formulate an urban plan in the language that the elites had identified as their own. So this is an architect that was working together in the same institution in Paris with Adolphe Pinard, the one who coined the term puericulture. So there was this group of architects and physicians working together and implementing the important role that architecture had in the establishment of eugenics. So curiously, the neo-colonial and Beaux-Arts styles were interchangeable as representations of the visual ideology of the country. And Agache's invitation suggests an interesting complicity between science and aesthetics in the practices of physicians and architects. Agache's proponents in Brazil were physicians, supporting the neo-Lamarckian ideas proclaimed at the Musée Social, where both Agache and Pinard were active members. But of course, sorry, I missed that image. But of course, the elites were not a homogeneous group, but they seemed to agree on the image they wanted for the city. Even Mario de Andrade, one of the main protagonists of the Semana de Arte Moderna, who that same year celebrated Brazilian identity as a mixture of the foreign, the indigenous, and the African. And Lucio Costa, the famous architect who would later develop supermodern Brasilia, the capital ex nihilo of Brazil, were open supporters of José Mariano Filho, the Brazilian physician who became the most vehement promoter of neocolonial architecture and also the main advocate for the appointment of Agache to develop the urban master plan for the Morro do Castelo Esplanade. So in 1921, Andrade clearly expressed his enthusiasm for the neocolonial, which he called the Brazilian style, with its cultural and racial associations. Oh, I'm late with this. Okay. Quote, this is Andrade speaking. There is nothing more glorious to us, Andrade argues, that the neocolonial style that a group of Brazilians and Portuguese architects and engineers in Sao Paulo seek to launch. Sao Paulo will be the source of a Brazilian style. Let me believe that, even though undisturbed by the diversity of the races, Sao Paulo's desire to be modern, European, and futuristic will give an architectural style to my Brazil, end quote. In 1928, in a series of articles in Diario Nacional, Andrade in fact celebrated the role of architects working for the normalization of the neocolonial as a Brazil national style. And Mariano Filho, who for over a decade had promoted the neocolonial as maternal architecture, in an article published in O Jornal in 1929, conclude that the neocolonial campaign was nothing less than a campaign for the rehabilitation of race as a key component of nation building. So in many ways, these modern attitudes sought to homogenize the city and with it its population by eradicating undesirable inhabitants and proclaiming the esplanade to be a political and economic altar to power, infused with white European forms. And it was not a coincidence that all this, the demolition of the mountain, the elimination of Rio de Janeiro's original urban nucleus, the displacement of its poor residents, and the construction of the exhibition pavilions were executed simultaneously, almost simultaneously, with the new policies and mandates such as the white-only decree of 1921, which literally prohibited the immigration of black to Brazil. Nevertheless, it is interesting to observe how Mario de Andrade and the other organizers of the Semana de Arte Moderno in Sao Paulo, in their frontal attack to what they believe to be a false modernity embraced by those controlling Rio's art establishment, paved the way for an art tradition that branded Brazil from then on precisely as tropical and heterogeneous. So these three well-known paintings by Brazilian artist Tarsila do Amaral brought to center stage two elements associated with backwardness: primitive, untamed nature, wild nature, and those people who the elites wanted to overlook, Indians and blacks. So these two elements were the very territorial targets of transformation of the eugenics movement: tropical environment and non-white people. The painting on the left, titled Abaporu, which means man who eats in Tupi-Guarani, the language of a tribe that was said to practice cannibalism, was the very painting selected to illustrate the 1928 Osvaldo de Andrade's influential anthropophagic or cannibal manifesto. So by adopting a metaphor for cannibalism, and thus implying the need to eat the enemy, to appropriate his best qualities, Andrade championed Brazil's digestion of European culture, metabolized now into something original, truly Brazilian. This was the very first declaration of a culture unique to Brazil, in which anthropophagy became its constitutive element. But I'm not saying that the Andrades and the other protagonists of the Semana de Arte Moderna in Sao Paulo were in disagreement with the colonialist and racist approach of Rio. Andrade, as well as the architects who participated in the Semana de Arte Moderna, were open promoters of the neo-colonial. Clearly, for them, there was no contradiction between neo-colonial architecture and the new aesthetics launched during the Semana de Arte Moderna. Because, as Walter Mignolo argues, there is no modernity without coloniality. Because coloniality, in fact, is the reversible and unavoidable side of modernity, its darker, hidden side. And as Mignolo argues, coloniality is constitutive, no derivative of modernity. We can talk about that later, but I think that this is a very important thing to realize when we are studying modernism, is colonial origin, is other side. But let's go back to the centennial celebration in Rio. One must ask, why did the organizers of this exhibition selected the neo-colonial style to represent the new modern country in the centennial anniversary of its independence? In other words, what do these two images, white people and neo-colonial architecture, have to do with each other? No one illustrates this connection between race and architecture better than Lucio Costa, the famous architect responsible for Brasilia, who in 1928 made this very racist link in a newspaper editorial. I'm pessimistic about architecture and urbanism in general. All architecture is a question of race. When our nation is that exotic thing that we see on the streets, our architecture will inevitably be an exotic thing. It is not those half dozen who travel and dress on Rue de la Paix, but that anonymous crowd that takes trains from Central Station and Leopoldina. People with sickly faces who shame us everywhere. What can we expect from people like this? Everything is a function of race. If the breed is good and the government is good, the architecture will be good. Talk, discuss, gesticulate. Our basic problem is selective immigration. The rest will change on its own. So the neo-colonial, which was in a sense anti-modernist, pro-Iberian, and white, was appropriated as the emblem of progress and modernity, suggesting that Costa intended for his eugenics syllogism of breed begetting good government, begetting good architecture, to also work in reverse. So in any event, the neo-colonialist white style represented in almost every pavilion at the exhibition was declared by the government from 1922 to 1938 to be the national style, mandatory for every building that will represent Brazil abroad. That only changed in 1939 in the warfare in New York, where the government hired Lucio Costa, and Lucio Costa, like always did, invited Niemeyer, and they created an amazing pavilion that then Le Corbusier copied, and you can see at Harvard is the Carpenter Center at Harvard, or something very similar. Perhaps this need to present modern Brazil as a homogeneous white society was behind the omission of race as a demographic factor in every national census from 1890 to 1940. This omission was not the result of a need to promote a race-neutral society, but of the fantasy of a much desired white Brazil. And this is a very interesting diagram. It was presented at the first Brazilian Congress of Eugenics in 1929, in the Congress where Roquete Pinto basically formulated the need to incorporate architecture into everything that has to do with eugenics. And this was a diagram that forecasts a country with zero Negro for 2012. And at the time, this diagram upset everyone, irritated everyone, but not because of its ideology, but because of the opposite, of how long it will take to achieve a white Brazil. So let me go to my final second part. And let's talk about Corbu. So in his complete works from 1934 to 1938, Le Corbusier included a sketch of the building for the Ministry of Health and Education in Rio de Janeiro. The sketch of the building that will later become the symbol of Brazil's modernism shows an open courtyard surrounded by pilotis and elderly tropical palms, and at its center a colossal sculpture of a seated man with a strong, well-defined body and a tiny head that you see over here. Gustavo Capanema, the Minister of Health and Education, had commissioned both the building that will host the state institution he called the Ministry of Man, which in his own words was destined to prepare, compose, and perfect the Brazilian man, and the sculpture he wanted to embody the ideal Brazilian man that the state itself was directed to produce. So following Lucio Costa and Le Corbusier's suggestion, Capanema asked the Brazilian artist Celso Antonio to produce a 12-meter high granite statue that will represent the ideal man at the entrance of the ministry building. Personally invested in finding a tangible image for the ideal Brazilian genotype, Capanema pondered, quote, "How will the body of the Brazilian man be, of the future Brazilian man, not a vulgar man or the inferior man, but the best exemplar of the race? How will his head be, his color, the shape of his face, his physiognomy?" End quote. For Capanema, this sculptural representation will not simply be a work of art, but rather a scientific tool to establish the Brazilian type, the ideal figure that will be legitimate to imagine as representative of the future Brazilian human being. To achieve this goal, Capanema turned to science. First, he turned to Francisco José Oliveira Viana, one of the main voices of the whitening thesis, which argued that by mixing black and mulattoes with whites, darker skin and black features will be filtered, and the white race, considered by Viana to be a superior race, will become dominant. Capanema also consulted with other recognized scientists, including Da Rocha Vaz, Álvaro Flores de Fonseca, and of course Edgar Roquete Pinto, the eugenicist who, at the opening of the first Brazilian Congress of Eugenics, argued for the instrumentalization of architecture in the process of ameliorating human beings. So these scientists' responses to Capanema's questions were extensively argued and supported by their own scientific studies, which indicated that in spite of their different views, the representation of the Brazilian man should basically be a white man. For the sculpture, Roquete Pinto proposed the adoption of one of the leucodermos, an anthropological term he used to classify the predominant type of whites in Brazil. He suggested a white man with dark enough skin to look Mediterranean, the white that will more easily acclimate to Brazil. According to Roquechi Pinto, the leucodermo was the racial type towards which the morphological evolution of the Brazilian population was marching. However, Celso Antonio, the sculptor who was commissioned for the project, didn't want to design a figure like the one described by the scientists. He believed that the Brazilian man will be one he observed on the streets. And Capanema, disgusted by the mestizo of rough figures that was taking shape in Antonio's atelier, invalidated the agreement with Antonio and held a competition to select an artist who will take over for Antonio in the design of the statue. So the statue was never built, but the pressure to define the ideal Brazilian man remained the agenda of the regime, and the building itself, which seems to have been created to transform a simple man into the Brazilian man, became the very embodiment of modernity. Within this context, it is very significant that Le Corbusier's working sketch for the series of lectures that he would deliver in Rio during the summer of 1936 placed the image of a simple man in a horizontal position at the base of his notes. Notice that in the last phrase of these notes, when Le Corbusier writes "Acheter livre Carrel" here, he reminds himself to buy the book by Alexis Carrel, the French Nobel Prize-winning physician who had just published the 1935 bestseller Man the Unknown, a book later considered a manifesto for white superiority intellectualism. The rest is cryptic. On the top, you see the word Castelo, then Lucio Costa, Carlos Porto, Pedro Alerpoli, and Castelo Cugrichet. The sketch brings together the mountain, Morro do Castelo, with the names of Brazilian modern architects, the most important French eugenicists, and the representation of the simple man who became the object of transformation for Carrel, Le Corbusier, and as we know, for the Brazilian government. What made Le Corbusier think of Carrel while thinking of Rio de Janeiro? Was Carrel's theory of the salvation of the white race at the core of Le Corbusier's ideas on landscape, urban planning, and architecture? It is not a mere coincidence that Castelo, the greatest eugenics laboratory in Latin America, is the first word that appears on the cardboard. It was the pulverized mountain from which hundreds of inhabitants were displaced. It was the esplanade that remained after this devastation that became the stage for the 1922 exhibition and its image of white Brazil. It was also the name of the epicenter of Agache's urban plan and its image of white Brazil. Of Agache's urban plan intended to cleanse the city of disease and undesirables, where he also visualized a tropical landscape, a tropical land cultivated and healed for the enjoyment of white people. And finally, it was also the name of the new building for the Ministry of Health and Education, the institution that will be in charge of developing and enforcing Brazil's eugenics policies for Getulio Vargas' new authoritarian regime, the building for which Lucio Costa was chosen as the leader of the design team and for which Le Corbusier just happened to be invited as a design consultant, will be located on this very site where the Castelo Mountains once stood. In fact, the association between Carrel and the built environment will become the trigger point for much of Le Corbusier's thinking over the next several years. But it was in Rio during the summer of 1936 that Le Corbusier clearly aligned himself with Carrel's ideas. Evoking Carrel's eugenics book, Le Corbusier commented to his audience, quote, "Plon, the editor who published my book in North America, celebrates the success of his latest book, Man the Unknown, by Dr. Carrel. Write, he told me, a book that will be an echo of that one. I will do it with pleasure, The Man and His Shell, end quote. So this appears to be the very first time Le Corbusier made public reference to Carrel and his work. And this cardboard note where he linked Carrel and Rio de Janeiro with the sketch of a man was the spark for new theories first articulated in the Rio lectures that will become a viable doctrine on the remaking of man, of an entire new way of life, of a new relationship between man and nature through which the built environment will be put to work. So in the end, this is not a story of Brazilian modernism, nor a story of European scientific concepts applied to the Americas. This is a transnational story that grapples with theories of modernity, modernism, and modernization, which places architecture at the very center of the eugenics agenda of white supremacy. So what the French thought was going to be the pure and direct materialization of Lamarckian eugenics, in fact turned out to be much more a negotiation between positivist ideologies and Brazil's innovative approach to its racial and environmental reality. In its search for ameliorating the race, this new eugenics found in architecture, urbanism, and landscape design both its technology and its ultimate aesthetic form. Thank you.
Thank you, Fabiola, very much. For everybody here, I'm trying to get to the end of this book. There's a part that she beautifully kind of brings us back to why it's so pertinent for us to understand the way history embeds ideology, embeds ways of thinking that are subversive and need to be called out. And so this is from the very end of her book. Although many of the federal and local policies that created race-based housing segregation, for example, in cities like Buenos Aires, Chicago, Paris, Rio de Janeiro, have been officially abolished worldwide, segregation persists in different forms and in many cases is provoked and consolidated not only by governments, but by architects as well. Underscore that part. Our built environment has too often been designed to exclude poor people and people of color by various means. By creating highways, we're super experts on that in Miami, that separate poor and black neighborhoods from wealthy and white ones, and from the so-called noble areas of city centers. Building walls, underscore the word walls, fences, all things like that, to seclude entire neighborhoods, eliminating sidewalks in government zones and in luxury residential areas to avoid the circulation of, quote, undesirable people, and instrumentalizing nature by delineating vacant green belts and natural reserves to cloister entire cities away from poor satellite neighborhoods and shanty towns. I am sure that all resonates with you guys. So, I would love to open, you might have comments or questions, but living in the city and being now observers of the city the way you are, you cannot not have something of your own experience or of your own kind of encounter that has strong resonances with what Fabiola just presented with us.
You might have went over this before, but I kind of just wanted like more clarification on it, because you
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So coloniality, and this is not my definition, this is a term that was coined by a scholar of the Global South, by Aníbal Quijano. Coloniality is the express manifestation of oppression at work globally. So when colonialism was no longer able to continue doing its sins, coloniality appears to continue doing its oppression. So coloniality is something that survived colonialism and is alive and well. And we can see that in books, in museums, in the academy, in the way that we treat others, in the way that we behave. So coloniality is alive and well. What I'm bringing to this is really something that I feel we have been ignoring in architecture, and is how coloniality and modernity, how colonialism and modernism are the two sides of the same coin. Let me just go to the material of like the situation in Brazil, for instance. So we are looking at the first years, 1920s, 1930s, in which we have this way of continuing the legacies of slavery and the colonial period within the modern period. But this arrived to its climax with the creation of Brasilia. So if you read, which is to me really amazing how we have been ignoring that, but if you read the descriptive memories of Brasilia in the Plan Piloto by Lucio Costa, and he actually used the term. And he actually talks about how the shape of Brasilia, that now people talk about that is an airplane, whatever, went from being a cross, right, the mark of conquest, of colonial conquest, into an airplane, the image of modernity, right? Even in Brasilia is that. So I'm talking about something that is there. I'm not talking about coloniality as something that is back in the past, but actually something that is at the very roots of modernism, which is based on the patriarchal racist society that implemented slavery. I don't know if I respond to your question. Okay. Thank you.
Hello. Hi. Thanks for the lecture. So I have a question about sort of going forward in today. So I don't know if it's a question of if it's hard infrastructure or soft infrastructure that needs to change, or what we need to approach, being designers and architects. But let's say if it was soft infrastructure, what can we do to change sort of how that interacts with our community, and are there ways to, I guess, rethink about, the structure of infrastructure in the city?
Thank you. Well, I really believe that history matters, and that the very first thing we need to do is to acknowledge how architecture had participated for way too long in all these processes of inequality, segregation, exclusion. The only way that we can do something about that is by recognizing that we have been participating, and we are still participating on those structures. So there is right now a book that for me has been very inspiring, written by Svatish. Please apologize my pronunciation of her last name. I'm sure that I'm pronouncing it badly, but it's something like Svati Chattopadhyaya. And the book is called On Learning the City. And the main argument that she makes is that in order for us to do a better job, we really need to learn infrastructure. So we really need to learn that the city is much more than infrastructure. That if we continue building only infrastructure, we will continue building inequality. That, the only way that we can do better is to work with the communities, is to learn from them, is to understand that there are other forms of knowledge that are absolutely required. I do believe that collaborative work is key in order to have better solutions. I totally believe in the process of co-learning, co-teaching, co-researching, crowdsourcing, right? Like when we work together, we have more than one perspective and we have more chances of doing the right thing or what we need to do.
Anybody else?
Here.
Well, here and then there.
I just wanted to ask, are there any modern examples that you can think of that are as brazen as this with propaganda and everything, as far as whitewashing communities or countries that you could think of? And has the propaganda changed with the internet and social media as far as like the methods to get that kind of information out there?
You mean that are like these ones in the same way or opposed to these ones?
Like as brazen as this has been.
As racist?
Right.
Oh my God, almost everything. Okay. Okay, for instance, I can tell you about one building that I'm sure most of you know and love, the Unité d'Habitation de Marseille by Le Corbusier, who he designed and built in the city of Marseille in the 1950s. That's a building that he actually visualized during the moment that he was attending a lecture by Alexis Carrel. So I was able to see these notes that he took during that talk. And he was listening to Carrel and listening about all these strategies to segregate people and making a white society and, creating a kind of puriculture top at the children kind of the kindergarten that was a kind of puriculture clinic on the top of the machine. All those things were inspired by Carrel's ideas. How is that we haven't talked about that? I mean, we are talking about Le Corbusier, that has been probably the modernist that had more literature and has been more studied than any other modernist. And we never talk about this. It was really surprising to me when I was doing the research. And if you ask me what is my theory about how this happened, I will tell you that I think that many people before me, they read exactly the same things that I read, they found the same documents in the archive, they read the same literature, and they make a very clear decision of ignore that, right? So that one, so the Unité d'Habitation de Marseille, that basically created a sort of typology that was reproduced around the planet, especially in the peripheries of cities, is a building that was designed following Carrel theories of white supremacy. I can talk a little bit more about puriculture. Puriculture is key, and Corbu talk about puriculture in several publications and in several letters and in several talks and in radio programs and in a very clear way. So puriculture was equivalent to eugenics. He used actually the two terms as together, like he used the two terms together as the two sides of the same coin. So what I'm saying about Corbu is not my interpretation. I'm just based what I'm saying on the archive and his own words.
Thank you so much for this lecture. I think it's really important to have this conversation here in Miami, right? Kind of the gateway to the Americas, as people like to call it, also part of a previous competition, right, for design for America. And so, kind of having that context, right, of being in Miami and seeing the amount of construction that has happened mainly luxury housing, right, for the last 15 years, it seems to be kind of as the epicenter of everything that you're describing, right? With, we know demographically, since the 50s, we've had different waves of kind of the most affluent people able to flee from different parts of Latin America and the Caribbean coming here, right? And at this time that, the last 15 to 20 years, we've seen this kind of extreme of luxury development, right? How do you see that kind of, this conversation, how do we evolve this conversation at the same time that we're having like an enormous pushback within the global markets? And, just as you had coloniality, right, now we are misusing words like socialism and communism to mean different things, different than what they were intended to be. And so, at the same time that you're having this very, eye-opening presentation, where you're having this conversation here in the face of, right, what is almost like hear no evil, see no evil, say no evil, right? So I'm just curious, how do you see this conversation kind of evolving?
If I could say it, like, instead of saying racism, we're saying socialism.
Replacing just planting some words, right?
Tell me again what you just said right now.
So using socialism and communism as the boogie word, like the bad, evil, really supplanting also the word racism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do believe that there is a kind of big effort right now in classifying everything, right? I have been called everything, from communist to, in Europe, I was called that I was a kind of representative, or that I was representing the wokeism of the US, who wanted to reach Europe also. And I was told, well, if you are so interested in helping the Native American communities, why you don't build better highways for them to get out of their, I heard the most absurd things. So I think that in this process of being so confused about terminology and where anything could mean anything, right? Like, doesn't really matter. I think that we really need to do a better job communicating what we do to the people who really think different from us. I think that we really need to open the conversation precisely to circles in which they will be completely against to the way that we are thinking. Because we need to win them. We need them. We need everyone in order to really have an impact and change. I'm not sure if I'm responding to your question. I'm not sure if I'm addressing what you...
It's really kind of more of a conversation piece. I don't know that anyone has the answer.
Yeah.
I'm just concerned that...
And if I may, it's what I'm understanding too is that it's much easier to use an ideology word than to confront the fear of otherness that perhaps is being hidden there.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, absolutely. You are absolutely right. Yeah. So in many cases, it's a defensive strategy, and that's what I'm thinking. What I'm saying, that is really important for us to be able to have a conversation with people who really disagree with the work we do, who really think that what you are doing is, something that is not important. I do believe that is really key.
Thank you so much for this. I think this is great. Thinking back in what we were discussing, due to Miami being kind of like a very young new city, it's 167 years old. I'm not sure, with new infrastructure, a mix of cultures from everywhere. Especially now after the pandemic, we have become a little bit of a crazy city, which the car is the most important item. The city is a city designed for the car and not for the individual. What we have now is a madness of development, from residential to commercial. There's nothing that is making the urban fabric and we are forgetting about the history of Miami. I think, and maybe you can help me, the biggest factor is how do we educate people to get familiar with this sort of information, right? It's like, I have people that ask, how do you deal with your clients? I feel the most difficult thing dealing with my clients is making them aware of the process of design, how much is the cost, how does construction goes, right? So how can we, how do we educate people on subjects like this? People that are not necessarily going to school or have access to these lectures or cannot access to the book. How can we do that? Which is what we're trying to do in Design 5, use our libraries as that branch of an educational institution. So any advice for the students that are working on this now?
Yeah. I think that we really need to, I do believe that universities are not or should not be islands, right? Isolated and very happy about themselves in their own kind of celebrated universalism, let's say. But actually, I think that the university has to see as a duty of the work they do as agents of knowledge production, as agents of education, to activate themselves. So I think that university has to be activist, and that we are called to really play a role that goes beyond the classroom and beyond the space of the university. So we are in a very elitist position, and the only way that we can actually do something that will be larger than ourselves, or the public that can come to this classroom, or the public that can read the book that we publish, is by finding ways of working really, I mean, I'm thinking like I'm becoming a kind of, but working with the community. I live in a city similar to Miami in so many different ways, and I teach in a university that is very happy of being this kind of island in the center of the city. And it's very difficult to do that. It's very difficult to go beyond the walls that make us to feel so special, so unique, so smart, so respected, right? In order to really work with all those communities that our own existence as a powerful institution has made them less, or has took resources from them. So, and I think that it's the same thing that I was saying about the connection between coloniality and modernity, and colonialism and modernism, right? If we don't understand that progress was made by destroying lands, displacing indigenous communities, taking their resources in order to create a different side of industrial production for bringing modernity to some places in the Western world. So we are really doing very little. But it's the same thing, I mean, it's the same structure, and that's why coloniality, in my opinion, is such a useful term.
People, and here, thank you so much, Fabiola. This was a tremendous honor.
Thank you so much.